Bon dia a tots. First of all, I apologize that I cannot speak Catalan. I did learn it and I've forgotten it all, but I'm very pleased to be here back in Barcelona. It's a very important time for everybody in Catalonia, and I feel privileged to be here when such enormous events are happening for you, and I really hope everything works out well. I think it will in the long run, but the short term could be difficult. I want to talk about change and tradition in university teaching. I'm going to report on a small project that I did, which involved one of the nicest jobs I've had to do recently, which was to go around and look at innovation in teaching in Canadian universities and colleges. We all know what the barriers are to professors using technology, and this was an opportunity to see why some professors, despite the barriers, were doing interesting things. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the paper. I'm assuming most of you will have read it. I'm going to ask the question, what is innovation and who decides what it is? Because I think that's an interesting question. One of the things that came up from the study was I was surprised at some of the projects that were put forward as being innovative. And so I want to go beyond that and ask what's the purpose of innovation in higher education teaching? Now, obviously, we can always do better, but innovation suggests doing something different. So why do we want to do something different in higher education? And lastly, the biggest question, how do we make it happen? So let me give you a brief overview. This project, there's been 3 researchers. One has gone around our biggest province in Canada, Ontario, and interviewed probably about 120 different faculty from different colleges and universities in Ontario. And they were so pleased with the results that they got, they put it up on the website. I'll give you the website later. That they wanted to extend it to the rest of Canada, and I got the contract to talk to the rest of Canada. And then there's somebody in Europe actually looking at European uses of technology. They're based in Paris, poor things. So I looked at 20 case studies. The way we identified them, most Canadian universities and colleges have a Centre for Teaching and Learning. And we just went to the director of that and said, choose 1 or 2 good examples of innovation and use of technology from your institution. Now, one of the reasons some of them weren't very innovative was because probably they didn't have anybody doing anything innovative, but they felt they had to give us something. What we found, and again, I have to say this was not set up as a research project. It was set up just to provide examples that other faculty to go online and have a look at and decide whether that was something that they could do as well. But when I looked at the 20 case studies that I did, I saw some patterns emerging. And I thought, why don't I just look to see if there are common features amongst these 20 cases that came forward. And the first one, I asked, it's a very simple question, why are you doing this? And there were 2 reasons that came up in nearly all of them. I think all of them either had one or both of these reasons. The first one was to expand access to students. So I'll give you one example of the professor who just put a webcam in the front of his lecture theatre and said to students, you can come into the class or you can watch it at home or you can download it whenever you want. Now, this is in a province where the winter it's -25, it snows very heavily, and he said, I've got a class of 200, I have 150, 170 in the first week, and by the time I get to the last week, there's about 20 people coming. And I lose those students, they don't take the exams, and so on. I put a webcam in, I've been ending up with about 140, 150 taking the exam and so on. So it's access. Not very interesting, you know, still a lecture. But the second one was to solve a teaching problem, that they had, for instance, students with different backgrounds coming into the same class from different disciplines. And how do you teach where they have different levels of knowledge in different parts of the course? About half the case studies move beyond traditional teaching. So this is a half full or half empty glass. You can say, well, it's good that half of them actually changed their pedagogy in order to use the technology. Or you can say, it's not really good that only half of them actually moved away from the traditional lecture. So it depends on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, how you look at that figure. But what was really clear is that none of them were driven by pedagogical theory or knowledge of pedagogy. Most of the faculty had no idea what the pedagogical theories were. Some of them wanted to increase collaboration amongst students, but it wasn't based on Terry Anderson's theory of interaction and so on. So it was a bit depressing, I'm afraid, to when I asked them, you know, well, what made you decide to take this teaching approach? And they had what I would call primitive ideas of how teaching should be done, and they were willing to push it a little bit beyond that primitive base of delivering information to students. The other thing that came out, and incidentally I've been doing another study which is almost a complementary study. I've been doing a national survey of online learning. So this is a statistical one where we've asked for statistical data from all the universities and colleges in Canada. And this one came out both in the case studies and in the national survey that most of the stuff that professors in Canada are doing are very low tech. Use of mobile phones, for instance, to record things. We didn't see any example of learning analytics being used, any examples of AI being used, very little open educational resource use. So all the things you see in the literature, in the blog posts and everything, it's going by the main of the faculties, even the ones who are considered to be innovative. And the other main finding, which is not surprising, is that there was no strategy for innovation in the institution. Now, some of them would give you a grant to do something different, so you could buy yourself out for one term, but if it was successful, there was no strategy to take it beyond the successful teacher into other classes and so on. Now, three of the projects did get into other institutions. One was from BC, it was the Justice Institute, which was a live conferencing system that allowed emergency response people to, wherever they were in the province, to come online and practice their emergency procedures in a simulation and then come back in. And that actually has gone beyond Justice Institute. It's gone into the use of, into the University Hospital in Vancouver, where it's used for training people on how to deal with an emergency situation in the hospital. Like, for instance, if you have a demented woman who suddenly disappears from the ward, who needs to be involved in that? And they can run that kind of online in real time and then come back in and do an analysis afterwards. So there were 2 or 3 that did spread beyond the institution, but not because the institution had a strategy to do it. It's just because other people heard about it and thought, oh, that's good, I could use that. And I think we really need to think about, if we have a success, if we have teachers doing really good stuff, how do we get that across at least the academic departments to which it's relevant? So quickly, what is innovation in higher education? Now, a lot of people think it's using new technology. Other people think it's teaching differently, which is my focus. It appears from the cases we got, it's anything that's not a lecture, seminar, or a physical lab. That's innovative, which is pretty depressing. My own view is that I want to see pedagogies that are focused on teaching students 21st century knowledge and skills, the skills they're going to need to live and work in a digital society. And I never heard any one of the 20 ever even mention that was one of their goals. It could be through new organizations, or it could be doing things differently. I put Stephen Downes up there, who doesn't think we should have universities or colleges. He thinks that students are autonomous and self-learning. I mean, that is definitely innovative, you know. Whether it'll ever work is another matter, but it's innovative. And the other question is, what do we want to keep as well as what do we want to change? Because there are a lot of good things about, especially universities these days and colleges, that we want to keep. Like, for instance, independent academic research, independent thinking, and so on. But are we actually teaching that? So why innovate? Well, unfortunately, the main one is what I call mob mentality. You know, MOOCs, they're innovative, so everybody rushes off to do a MOOC. Aren't we being innovative? Until you're the 165th institution doing a MOOC, and then suddenly you're not innovative anymore. Government pressure. I mean, definitely government pressure in Canada. We've had Ontario government has set up eCampus Ontario, who's put a lot of money into online learning course development and so on. So there's pressure from government. Some of the institutions are looking to reduce costs and cost effectiveness. That didn't come up in any of my 20 studies, although sometimes it was implicit. I had one teacher who had a class of 1,000 students because nobody else would teach the course, and he had to find a way to deliver that to 1,000 students. So, but the primary one seems to be to widen access and increase student flexibility, which is a good reason for innovation. Nobody really mentioned, only one mentioned student engagement. It was the innovations were instructor-focused rather than student-focused. Apart from the access and flexibility, it was how does this make my job easier, not necessarily how does it make more fun for the students. Although some of them would say that at the end of the interview, and it was more fun for the students, as if it was an afterthought. So how do we make innovation happen? Well, I think institutions should have a strategy for innovation, and this is not rocket science. If you look at a lot of the big companies, big successful companies, certainly in North America, many of them have a deliberate strategy to support innovation, like building skunk works and find out what, putting a little body aside that don't have to worry about making money in the company, but can experiment, and if it works, they bring it into the main company. Change the reward system, we can talk a lot about that. Make it worthwhile teachers doing something different and actually make a real difference to their promotion rather than just their research. I think we need to change graduate programs to include pedagogical and teaching skills. If you want to go and work in a university eventually, then you should not just be skilled in research, you should be skilled in teaching as well. And we don't do that, not in North America anyway. And maybe new institutions or models of education, but there are at least 2 people in this room who've been parts of new models of education, and the government's chopped them at the first opportunity. So if you're not a standard institution, you're putting your head above the foxhole, and you're liable to get it shot off. So other ways, that's perhaps something we can discuss how to make it happen. So in conclusion, I think there are major changes happening. I was very encouraged to see professors taking easy-to-use technologies and thinking about how to use them. It's being driven largely by online learning rather than new technologies. Do we want innovation? Is it a means to an end, or is it good in its own sense? Can we build a knowledge base on successful innovation? Can we do here and collect some things together and say, well, that works, and can we apply those principles to innovation in other institutions? And lastly, be careful what you wish for. Some of the innovations, I think, were actually worse teaching than good face-to-face teaching. So, it can't just be innovation for its own sake. It has to deliver on improved educational performance. So thank you very much. And over to you, Lisa.
Should I ask him the questions? Okay. All right. As part of this panel discussion of 2,
we are meant to ask each other questions. And so now that Tony has finished with his presentation, I have a couple of questions for him about the content. And no, it's okay, Tony, you'll be fine. You talked about pockets of innovation, and you talked about how institutions generally did not have a strategy for disseminating teaching innovations. How can this be addressed? And how do you manage the situation where teachers don't want to innovate? They don't want to change?
Well, I think the study... I think the study provided one indication in that it has to solve a problem that the teacher's got. If you can come forward and say, if you want to help somebody to change, then you have to find out what their problems are to start with. You can't just assume that we can sell them the idea that we have better pedagogies than the ones they're using. If they can get by in doing what they're doing, which most of them can, because nobody's going to go in and make a big fuss unless the students actually rebel and walk out of the class, which does happen sometimes, they're not going to change. So I think my strategy has always been, as an instructional designer, to try to work with an instructor to find out what their problems are and what they really like help with. And I think they are very intelligent people, university professors. They often understand they've got a problem, and often they don't know what to do to solve that problem in their teaching. They know when their students are bored. They know when they're not really getting good results in the exams. And so try to focus on how to help them deal with that anxiety they've got about their own teaching. And I think the second, so that's a bottom-up approach, if you like, and I think there's a top-down approach, which is for the university to constantly emphasize the importance of teaching, put in rewards for teaching, like, for instance, my university has tenure track for you can become tenured teacher on the quality of your teaching alone without research. But we have, I think UBC has about 1,500 full-time tenured professors, and 10 of them are on tenure track for teaching. So you can see, they don't really think that's where the university should be when you look at where the money goes. So I think, yes, there's a lot of talk by institutions about wanting to be innovative, but they're not prepared often to make some of the sacrifices, like moving resources away from some areas in order to reward teaching. Unless they do that, it's not going to happen.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit today about HiToGoji. How many of you have heard of HiToGoji before? Oh my goodness, wow, this is great. You read the paper, right? What in the world is this, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But before I do, I want to jump into first some of the challenges that we're facing within higher education, just to give you just an overview, a synopsis of what my perception is of the many challenges that we're facing today in higher education. And technology would be one of those. Okay, that's not working. There we go. The first is technology, okay? Technology is hitting us from all sides. When I first presented my doctoral thesis, my idea, it was about bringing social media into the classroom, and most of the people, except for one person, said, technology will never impact education today. I think if you look at all of the things that are happening right now, you see that this is just not going to be the case. Technology is infiltrating, it's seeping into education in so many ways and in so many different forms. And these are just a few examples of how that's happening. Delivery frameworks. There's a number of new delivery frameworks for knowledge, for information, for networking, for connections, the MOOCs, the social media, open source software. All of these delivery frameworks are giving us more opportunities for really delivering our courses within education. Our pedagogies are changing. There's a number of different pedagogies out there that, that are being used within, within education, because we're dealing with all of these new things. We're dealing with all of these tensions, these new developments, and we're not quite sure how to deal with them, so we're trying out a lot of different things. And some of these are listed here, and I'm not going to go into them because I just don't have the time this morning, but this is just an overview of all of the different, different pedagogies that we're exploring as a way to really deal with the technology issues, the many issues that we're dealing with within higher education. Okay, so these are some of the forces then that our institutions are dealing with. Okay, so we've got technology, we've got delivery frameworks, we've got pedagogies, which we have to deal with as instructors, but our institutions are dealing with a lot of change. There's changing demographics, more diversity, lifelong learning is becoming more and more of a priority. There's increased costs, at the same time reduced funding. So students want to have more. They want to have more technology in the classroom. They want to have more technology-based education. Rise of nationalism is happening, you know, and that's impacting the collaborations, the partnerships that we're having with other institutions in other countries. Industry demand, a big deal. Upskilling, soft skills. Our workforce, they're saying we want to have students that can hit the ground running as soon as they come out of the higher education institutions, but we're not doing that. Our students don't have the skills and competencies that they need. And I think Tony made a good point about that, you know, in all of his conversations with teachers, that didn't come up. What skills do our students need in the 21st century? And this, I think, this next slide is something, it came out in August, and it was a letter from professors at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, where they basically told their students, think for yourself. Okay, and when I read that, my first thought was, wow, why do we have to tell our students to think for themselves? You know, why is this important? Why is this news? Why is this something that we need to be doing? Well, I understand why it is that we need to be doing this, because I'm an American and I did not vote for Trump. And so there's a lot of things that are happening, and our students aren't thinking for themselves. They're not making decisions, they're not thinking critically about the information that they're presented with. And so what do? What can we do in order to help them to develop the necessary skills to think critically, to get the information that they need, analyze it, and then determine whether or not it's valid and whether it should fit into their personal knowledge framework, so to speak. So my answer to that, or Stuart Haas and Chris Kenyon's answer to that, is HiToGoji, or the study of self-determined learning. And I'm just going to give you a quick crash course into what HiToGoji is. It's based on 4 principles, central to which is learner agency. And learner agency basically means that the learner makes mostly all of the decisions about their learning. They decide what they will learn, they will decide how they will learn, they will decide the activities they will undertake in order to accomplish learning, and they will also assess their learning whether or not they've achieved what they set out to do. And this is very challenging, and I know many people will be going, oh, how do I make this happen? The other thing that HiToGoji is about, it's developing capability, okay, and self-efficacy. It's making people feel confident in their learning, their ability to assess things. Capability is a little bit different from competency, okay? Competency basically means I can do the skill, I can do what you've told me that I need to do. Okay? Capability means that you're able to take that skill and you're able to adapt it in new and unique environments. Okay? So it's not necessary, just having a competency isn't enough nowadays. You need to be able to take that competency and you need to apply it within new and unique environments. In my previous life, I worked at a software company. And I was telling one of my colleagues this morning, I said, we hired a huge amount of people in a very short period of time. They had the competencies, many of them. They didn't have the capability. So it took them a long time to adapt to the complexities of a rapidly changing software environment. So what we need to do is we need to help our students develop capability and to have self-efficacy. Another pillar of HiToGoji is reflection, metacognition, okay? And it's not just reflecting on what you've learned. okay? It's thinking about, how did I go through that process? What's the best process that I use for learning? How does this new knowledge affect my value system? How does it affect the way that I interpret the world and the society around me? So there's a lot of really thinking about not just what I've learned, but thinking about how I've learned it and how it impacts me as a person. And that draws on a lot of the double loop learning stuff, which I'll talk about in just a second. Nonlinear design, okay? Nonlinear design is another key part of HiToGoji. And what nonlinear design means is the student is making the decisions about how they will learn and what they will learn. And this will take them in many different directions. So there's no prescribed curriculum. There may be a prescribed learning outcome where the instructor says, okay, at the end of this semester, I want you to be able to do this, this, and this, or we're going to work together to define what it is that you need to do by the end of the semester, in which case it's working together to set those learning outcomes. But how the learner goes about it is defined by them. And this is very nonlinear. So, one of the things that often comes up when I talk about HiToGoji is that a lot of people say, well, none of this is new, Lisa. This is all stuff that, Maslow talked about, and that was constructivism, double loop learning, Shun's stuff on reflective practice, transformative learning from Mesereau. So it's built on all of these theories. It's emerged from these theories. So there's certain components of these theories that are included within HiToGoji. And what I often say when people ask me, well, if it's really not anything new, I say it's a repackaging. Because of the context that we're in, we need to think about our context. How can we repackage those theories to be learner-centered, to work in these new environments? Okay. One of the challenges that we have, there's two different schools of thought about self-determined learning, okay? One school of thought says, well, students need to move along a continuum. Academics love continuums. Somebody explained that to me last night. We love continuums. And so this is the PAH Continuum, and this basically looks at, moving students along from pedagogy, where, they're engaged, the learner maturity, it's a little bit less than what it is at the next level. They aren't required to have a lot of autonomy, a lot of structure. Those of you who are familiar with the transactional distance theory from Moore are aware of, the structure, the balance of structure and dialogue. So basically, they're at a very, very pedagogical low level, okay, of the continuum. At the next level, we move to andragogy, which is the self-directed learning. And basically what happens there's more learner maturity, they take more responsibility for their learning, they self-organize, they regulate, and then once they go to HiToGoji, they're making decisions for themselves. They're deciding, what they're going to do in terms of their course, what they're going to do in terms of their study. So for our brains, we're kind of like, okay, this makes sense because kids can't do self-determined learning, okay? And then they get to high school, they get to college, they can do andragogy. And then once they get to the higher levels, maybe they're working on their doctorate, then they can do the HiToGoji. That's the thinking of the PAH Continuum, okay? That the more mature and the more responsibility learners take for their learning, the quicker they move along the continuum, okay? Now, there's another school of thought about self-determined learning, and that is that our learners are actually self-determined from the very beginning. That means when we bring our kids into the school system, they're self-determined learners. They can make decisions on their own, they can organize themselves, and they can learn on their own, okay? So there's different schools of thought about this, and there's some controversy because there are many teachers that say, no, this can't be done. And an example of that, I'm working with some colleagues in Israel, and they're teaching teachers on how to be teachers. So they're basically educating a big population of the big population of teachers within Israel, and they introduced self-determined learning. And they told their teachers, we're going to teach you how to do self-determined learning, and then we want you to go teach your kids how to do it. And all of the teachers across the board said, this won't be possible. Our kids can't self-organize. They can't make decisions. They can't just make decisions about their learning or be self-determined learners. Well, after about 12 weeks, the teachers went through the process. They started to introduce self-determined learning. And they came back and they reported their utter amazement at how these kids could make decisions about their learning, and how they were actually engaged in the learning process. They understood things, they were exploring things, and they were excited about it. And so it was a real big difference for them. So, like I said, two different schools of thought. One is self-determined learners from the very beginning, or we need to move them along a continuum. From my perspective, I believe that everyone's self-determined from the get-go, yeah? And then when we get into the school system, we get into the chalk and talk. Okay, so we're telling our kids what they have to learn, how they learn. And I know this from my own experience as a teacher at the graduate school level. I get students that really, they don't want anything else but chalk and talk. Okay, they don't want to have to take control of their learning and make decisions about their learning. So they're still in this PAH continuum. They're still at the pedagogy, the andragogy, and I'm constantly trying to move them to being more self-determined learners. Okay, I'm not going to go through this slide because we don't have a lot of time. And so, but this gives you just a real quick and dirty overview of how it is that pedagogy, andragogy, and HiToGoji are differentiated. Okay, so if you want to read it, take a quick picture and... Okay. So how do we make this happen in real life? How does it look like in practice? Well, what we do is we create learner-centered environments. The learner is really the center of everything. There's collaboration, there's peer learning, and deep learning happens because what we're doing is we're guiding the learner through the process. The instructor takes the role, as many of you are familiar with, a guide on the side, or a new phrase that I really like at the moment. It's called ACE in the space. And so ACE in the digital space, I added the digital. I thought that was pretty... ACE in the digital space. That's cooler than guide on the side. So, but we're there to really help them through this process. We're the gurus. We know the connections. We know what we need to do to help our students to learn and to build upon their learning. So these environments are also creative and innovative, and then we get back to the question of what is innovative. And a lot of that is determined by the learner. They can decide what kind of environment that they want to learn in and how they're going to create that environment. It's personalized so that the learner defines what it is they're going to learn and how they'll learn it. It's a lot about exploration and inquiry. That we are always, one of the things that I do in my courses is pushing them with questions, okay? Think deeper about this, go further with this, have you thought about this? So they make a decision about the direction that they want to go in, and then I just give them additional information to help them along their way. Risk-taking and failure, okay? My kids went to a German school. Risk-taking failure is not characteristic of German schools. Failure is not something that is something that's really accepted within the school system. But I can tell you, when I think about myself and my children, we have learned so much from the mistakes that we have made. And I think if you think about things that you've learned the most about, it was from making mistakes. I mean, I think even Stephen Jobs had talked about this when he was talking about his past in Apple. You know, one of the biggest things that made him change was failing at Apple the first time. So, you know, we need to have failure in our lives to learn. So that's one of the things that we encourage within HiToGoji. ICT, PLEs, we need to incorporate technology. Okay, my big thing is bringing in social media, helping students connect with the outside world so they can start building their networks before they even get out there. They can start building their personal learning environment. They can start identifying, where do I get my information? Where is good information? How do I connect with people? Who do I connect with? How do I evaluate information? So it gives them an opportunity to really have kind of a test environment before they move out into the quote-unquote real world. So these are some of the learner characteristics of learners that learn in a HiToGojical environment. They're autonomous, they're connected, self-determined, self-regulated, self-directed. Teacher characteristics. I often get from teachers will say to me, well, if I'm not doing the teaching, then what am I doing? My role is diminished. Yeah, it's not important anymore. Well, I'll tell you it is important because teachers are the ones that are guiding these students through the process. And I've looked at a couple of different schools that have actually implemented self-determined learning. And when I've talked to some of the teachers, and what the teachers have said is that initially they thought, well, I'm not really going to be doing that much, yeah? I'm just going to be answering questions if they have questions. Well, what happens is these students come with questions that the teachers didn't even think about or they didn't know about. So these teachers are scurrying to learn more, and they found that much more enriching to their jobs because they were learning more things, because their students were actually motivating them and spurring them on to learn more in different areas of the field. So what kind of characteristics do we need to have within our teachers? Openness to change, they need to be optimistic, flexible, and they need to be facilitators, and they need to be models of lifelong learning. What are some of the institutional characteristics? Now, HiToGoji, within the organizations that I've looked at, the strategies that they've used have been a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. So there's been a real holistic approach. There has to be support from all levels of management. You need to have champions within the organization. You need to have opportunities to disseminate best practices. And so within an institution, some of the characteristics that I've seen where HiToGoji works, there's a shared vision. Leadership is innovative. Innovation is important to them. They have the kind of organizations that Tony was talking about where there's a group of people that are testing out new innovations, they're modeling them, and if they work, then they start to spread them out within the organization. They're agile, they have a culture where people are open to change, okay? And there's support for students and teachers in this process. We don't, in the cases that I've looked at, they don't just let them go free and running. They make sure that there's support there for the students. And they also use a lot of industry partnerships. And not just industry, but just organizations within just the general society, within the community. One example is from Australia. They do a lot of stuff with entrepreneurship. So they start the kids start their own companies when they're like 13, 14 years old, and they work together with entrepreneurs within the community on how to do that. So there's lots of opportunities there, but you need to have a holistic approach. So these are, again, one of those slides you could take a picture of because I'm not going to go through every single one because I hate reading slides. Why HiToGoji? These are some of the top research-based reasons. There's been different research into HiToGoji within different levels of education, from grade school up into the primary, secondary levels, and into the graduate levels. And these are some of the reasons. And also within vocational school, lifelong learning. And these are some of the reasons. For me, the last one is important because it teaches them to think for themselves. And I think this is something that we're doing our students a disservice if we're not forcing them to do that. So, and those are all my references. And this is on SlideShare. So if you Google me on SlideShare, no, Google me, find SlideShare, I'll be there. And my presentation will be there. So, and now Tony's going to grill me and ask me all kinds of questions. I'm just going to, all right, Tony, I'm ready.
Okay. Well, I have a real problem here because I don't really disagree with anything that you've said. So I do think it's a very good way to teach. But I guess my question is that within the higher education framework, are there boundaries? Are there areas where this doesn't work, in your view, where another approach might be needed?
I get this question a lot. And there's different layers to the question. one of them has to do with the principles of HiToGoji, and another of them has to do with, you know, does this really fit to my discipline or to the students that I have? And I've talked about HiToGoji in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different conferences, and I get grade school teachers that say, oh no, this would never work for my kids. And then I get high school teachers that say, this would never work. I get graduate professors that say, this would never work for my environment. So I get it from all areas, and I always have an example of when it does work, when it has worked. So in terms of the discipline and where it can be applied, I think there's many opportunities to do it. Any opportunity that you have to push your students to be more responsible for their learning, to make decisions about their learning, is a move toward HiToGoji. So that's one aspect. In terms of the principles of HiToGoji, in order to have a 100% HiToGogical environment, you'd almost have to get rid of the institution, except if you had the institution there as a supporter of developing networks and creating an environment where they create a bridge to wherever the student is going to next. For example, if they're entering into the workforce. Self-assessment is a big issue within HiToGoji. It's usually the stumbling block where people say, okay, I can't let students assess my work. I have certain standards that have to be met that my institution has defined for me. This was the case, for example, in Australia. They had certain standards that were decided by the ministry that said students have to be able to do this by the end of the year. And what they found, they decided to go ahead with the self-determined learning anyway, just to see if it would work. They have an amazing, at this school, they have just an amazing leadership there. And they said, we're just going to go for it. And the students came out and they actually knew more. And part of the reason that happens is once they start exploring ideas, they aren't caught within one discipline. Right? So all of a sudden they're moving outside of disciplines as they explore new ideas, as they explore learning, as they gather new knowledge. And so what happens is they may start with history and all of a sudden they're learning about geography. Okay? Or they're learning about social issues. And so there isn't any more, okay, this teacher is going to teach this teacher is going to teach this. So there's opportunities for cross-disciplinary learning. The assessment is a problem because our institutions don't allow our students to assess their work. We can do that within the classroom. We can say, Yishay was just telling me within his course, one of his courses, he had the students, design their own rubric. He was telling me this last night. And they didn't want to do that. And that's also very common. Students will often say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to take, they're basically saying, I don't want to take responsibility for my learning. But we can do that by having them assess their work and then kind of doing a check and balance saying, well, does that really fit with what I think that they've accomplished? I've done a lot of peer assessment within my courses where peers will assess each other, and they're sometimes a lot more brutal than I am. And sometimes the students are a lot more tougher on themselves. But I would say in probably 95% of the cases where I've done this, the students are pretty much on the mark. Yeah, in terms of what they're capable of, what they've learned. And so, yes, I do think that there are barriers to realizing it, but I don't think those are barriers that can't be overcome. But that's because I'm an eternal optimist, I think.